I'm going to turn, kind of go in a different direction here with things. That at some point, maybe I'll return a little bit to the cosmic battles. If I get my thoughts together on some of the other things I've looked at. But for now, I'm going to move away from that, and I'm going to go into another topic that is, you could say, heavy on my mind, or something I look at a lot. It's not going to be in depth, and I'm definitely not going to go into everything I've looked at, because I definitely do not feel comfortable in expressing it all. However, there are some basic things I would like to look at, and that is related to the cross. You said many times recently that the cross it's everything. It's the center of everything. The whole, from the if we want to call it the fall of man, all the way through the Old Testament. That's what it was leading up to. It was leading up to that final moment when God was going to right everything, and He did that on the cross. And that's we've talked about cruciformity in the past, or cruciform living, but also, as Greg Boyd calls it, a crucivision. So when you're looking at the Bible, you are looking at everything you look at in the Bible. You have to look at through the lens of the cross, because that was the ultimate expression. Do I need to say anything over again?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. So the ultimate expression of who God is and what He's about went through the cross, and we see pictures of the cross throughout the Old Testament. I have a great Bible called the Jesus Bible, and that's what it does. It's an NIV, but it has notes all through it. As you go through it, it shows this is a picture of Jesus. This is a picture of Jesus. And so that's where it goes to. And so for the next few weeks, at least, I want to talk about the cross, and how the cross is God's call to mankind and to the celestials, as we've just seen, to end violence. So I hope that when I talked about the cosmic battles, that I said it enough, that the cross, to me, in my opinion, this is not something I've read from anybody. It's just the things I've looked at from other people as I would do in the cosmic battles, and as you're just thinking about it, and the things that Paul writes. The cross is for all of creation, not just for mankind. And all of creation included what was going on, God's cosmic battles. And I think the whole point to that, if we go through it, is God's wanting to finally defeat evil and chaos from exerting its forces on creation, those anti-creational forces. And God all He did was hold them back. And every time there was a judgment, if you look at, He held it back to make creation. Then He held it back. He kept holding it back, and He let it go with the flood. I mean, that's a picture of it. Whether He physically let go and the waters rushing in was the sea of chaos, the waters from above and from below. I don't know. I don't think the point is to know. I think the point is there's a picture there of God holding back chaos. And when the earth and humanity mingling with the celestial beings, or vice versa, and things got so bad, and God's like, I wish I hadn't have made them, because look what they've done. All He had to do was pull His hands back and let it all rush back in. And so I know I mentioned this before, but evil, God uses evil to defeat evil. You can see that in the pictures of Israel being taken into captivity. Israel became evil. And how did God defeat the evil? He allowed, or if we want to say, pulled his hands back from the nations that surrounded Israel that he'd been protecting them from, and those nations rushed in. You read Job chapter 1 and 2 with Satan or the adversary. What did God do? Satan said, you have a hedge around him. That's why he acts like he does. And so God said, okay, well, I'll remove the hedge. And what happened? In came chaos and evil upon Job. You see it as we saw a picture of Israel passing through the Red Sea, Jesus calming the sea, being able to walk on the sea. Those are all pictures that we should associate with the larger evil in creation. And then to me, finally, what we just talked about, the elements being dissolved. The elements of the earth were dissolved. The elements of the heavens were dissolved. And then we get to the point where in Revelation, the sea is no more. It's gone. So, that whole picture, God never desired in the beginning that anyone would die, that he didn't desire that Adam and Eve would die. He didn't desire that the beings that came to earth and ended up being destroyed here would die. He didn't desire any of that. He didn't desire violence, death, chaos, evil, anything. In Ezekiel 18, he says, do I delight in the death of the wicked? And of course, there's more going on in that passage, and some of the wicked are going to end up dead. But it's not a delight. It's not a vengeful action where I can't wait to crush and kill them all. That's not God. It's more of a sorrowful thing. I think you read in Hosea, you get God's emotion and his sorrow over what's happened with his people. And that's exactly the idea you get too when it's in Genesis 6, when he has to flood the earth. It's that regret, and it's a sorrowful regret. It's not a I can't believe I made those guys. I can't wait to drown them all in a flood. It was way more than that. And it's a lot of people don't want to ascribe those types of things to God, but the scriptures are full, especially the Old Testament, are full of things that show that God did have those types of emotions. So God wanted a creation that was one with him, harmonious, peaceful, and loving. I think he wanted a creation that was going to be able to create in and of itself, a creation to be just like him. Of course, we read that everybody, or all creation is to worship God. And I think in that form of worshiping God, it's more than just in fact, it is not, I am the supreme being of the universe. You must worship me, or else. It's a back and forth. It's a relationship that he wanted between creation, us, and him. It was never intended that violence or hatred would enter into it and rule men's hearts, which is unfortunately exactly what happened. I don't think that God looked to when God brought out Israel and he was sending them to their own country. I don't think that he had in his mind, I'm going to need them to build a large army and go out and slay a bunch of people and kill pregnant women. And it sounds terrible, but rip the babies out of their wombs. I mean, those are the things that a lot of scriptures say and ascribe to God. And I don't think that was in his mind when he put them there. Those are the things that happen. but I'm not sure that exactly that's what his initial intentions were. And the final solution, when you get through all that, is that it would be Jesus Christ and him crucified. So there's two passages, and I've read the one in Luke frequently in the past several weeks, but I'm going to read it again, and it's from Luke 24, verses 25 and 27. It says, "Then he said to them, 'Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?' Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all of the scriptures." Jesus is in all of the scriptures, in some form, shape, or way. I mean, we might not ever understand it. We can read the scriptures 1,000 times, memorize them, look at hundreds of commentaries that try to point these things out, and there are places that we're just not going to understand it. And it's not to say that, in points of violence, Jesus is in there, but I think the idea is that in points of violence, there's that, but the cross. And he says in all the scriptures, and he's talking about Greek scriptures here. Most likely the Septuagint was what he got his information from. And if you don't have a Septuagint, I highly recommend that you get one. I mean, you can get one there are several different translations. Benton is the most popular English translation, but there are other more modern translations of the Septuagint, and it's just amazing. And some of the things I'm looking at about violence, the Hebrew men who translated Hebrew into Greek, translated into Greek in many places in the Psalms that talked about ascribing violence to God. In the Psalms, in the Septuagint, a lot of times it says the complete opposite. So I think there's an idea by the time they're writing this, I want to say that they're getting closer to who God is, and so they're starting to see some things in their ancient times that maybe weren't exactly correct. And so I think if you have the Septuagint and you at least compare it to the Old Testaments that we have, you'll find most of it, probably 90% of it's pretty close to the same. But there are some amazing differences in some of it, and it's pretty neat to look at. I compare a lot with it. But the next passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Where Paul is saying, "When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God." And so you have to ask, well, what is the power of God? Is it famine, earthquakes, pestilence? Is it falling stars and bitter waters? Massive armies with chariots and horses and massive rows and rows of archers, followed up by whatever they followed up next, because I'm not up on what ancient armies were comprised of, but that's when you read the power of God in the Old Testament, a lot of times that's what you get. That's what people take out of it. Oh, that was the power of God. But I don't think that's what God wanted people to think of him. He did mighty works, it says, for Israel, so that the world would know who he was. and as we saw in the cosmic battles, much of the mighty work he was doing was either against real cosmic beings or against imagined cosmic beings of the people of Egypt. And everything that happened to him, every plague that happened to him, was because the God that was supposed to do those things for them didn't do it. And the reason that God didn't protect them was because it wasn't that God that protected them. It was the very God that removed his hands and allowed evil to reign in those plagues. So what is the power of God according to Paul? What's the power of God according to Jesus? The power of God, according to that passage you just read, is Jesus Christ and him crucified. That is the power of God. And the very same way that Paul says he came to them that way because he's imitating Jesus Christ. And that's how Jesus Christ came. He came in weakness. He came with, I'll say, with trembling. I mean, he came with humility, and that's really what Paul's driving at there. The humbleness that he had before the people of Corinth, to show that he is not somebody. He is just a guy like all the rest of you, except for I believe in the power of God and the power of the Spirit that resides within me. And that power doesn't raise me above anybody else. That power came in weakness, so I come to you in weakness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, the chapter ahead, if you're able to keep up, it says, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For the Jews demand signs, and the Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." That's, to me, is more and more just an incredible a passage, because it describes God's plan and the means that God wants to be seen by humanity perfectly. God is powerful. He's the most powerful being in the universe. He is the creator. He made everything. Him through through his son and his son through him. Together they made everything that exists. Without them, nothing would exist. That's pretty powerful. He can hold back incredible malicious chaos beyond our imagination, and he could let it go to do what it wants. He can step in and stop it, and again, and push it. I mean, his power was displayed for men. A huge pillar of fire, a pillar of clouds, sending fire from heaven down to Elijah's to altar. I mean, there's just so many examples that we can get of the power of God, because he's very powerful. But that's not necessarily, I mean, God needed to be seen certain ways to certain people, but ultimately the cross shows, this is how I want to be seen. My weakness, what you perceive to be weakness, is stronger than human strength. What is human strength? And I think that's a a big point to look at. I mean, I've never looked at this passage like this before, but this is in part a direct refutation of all of the military might of Israel, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, the Philistines, whoever, all through history. Who's stronger? Who's bigger? Who has the bigger army? Who can go through and take over all the rest of you and keep you in subjection, in slavery, by doing terrible things to each other, through fear? That's a picture that people started to have of God. And as I said, talking about ancient Near East people, that's what they thought of their gods. And the problem is that that's how people saw God, the God of Israel. But that's not how he wanted to be seen. And so eventually he works up to it. And at the right time in history, he brings the cross and he shows, this is my power. My power is not to pound you over the head. My power is to give myself completely in the ultimate love. As Jesus said, the ultimate love is to lay your life down for a friend or for another. That's the ultimate sign of love. The complete disregard of your safety or yourself, to die. And that's what he did on the cross. So he showed, I am going to conquer all of you, and I'm going to conquer you with my love. And eventually you will all come to see that, and you will love me and I will love you. And then things are going to be right, through the cross. So there is a quote we were talking about, what did they use to show who God was, what the cross was about? We say often it's easy to think because we have a Bible, and we read the scriptures, and we read things like Jesus used the scriptures and Paul opened the scriptures. What we know that the scriptures are the Old Testament, but when you go to the Old Testament, I guess that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. We need to be able to see in the Old Testament the cross, the pictures of the cross, and then we need to see things. We need to see things that don't seem to line up with the cross, and we need to examine them and try to get an understanding if we can. I mean, we might not be able to with everything, but I think that the more we can see that this doesn't line up with who God is. Jesus was the exact imprint of God on this earth. When you saw Jesus, when you heard Jesus talk, when you saw the things he did, when he was up on the cross dying a horrific death, that's God. And so, I'll just leave it at that. When you're reading the Old Testament, I think it's something I'm learning to do, to look at it and try to see. I mean, there might be evil things that happen in the Old Testament, and there might be a reason they happen, but you got to try to see it somehow through the lens of the cross, because that is everything. So Paul uses the quote about the wisdom of the wise. It's from Isaiah 29:13-14. It says, "The Lord said, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their worship of me is a human commandment learned by rote." I find that, I'm just going to stop for a second there. That's a really interesting statement. Their worship of me is a human commandment learned by rote. As I was reading that, it just kind of jumped out at me. That's worth some time and thinking. In verse 14, it says, "So I will again do amazing things with this people, shocking and amazing. The wisdom of their wise shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning shall be hidden. Again, Israel is going to be tried, I'll say, in a furnace, because there are other verses in Isaiah that talk about it that way. He says, I'm going to remove the dross. I'm going to take it away from you. I'm going to make you new. I'm going to make you a new nation again. And you're going to be back with me. My law is going to be written in your hearts. And that's what's about to happen to them. It's almost like going all the way back to Egypt all over again into another furnace, because you went through that furnace, you came out, and now you've gone way from where you were supposed to be. But we're going to go through a little bit here of human power versus God's power. But before we get that, I want you to think about verse 13 of Isaiah 29 there. It says, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. Now, he's talking about worship, but I think it's not a stretch to lump everything Israel's done into that verse, because there was a way they were supposed to represent God on the earth, and they didn't do it. And, as Paul says, he wants us to be living sacrifices. God wanted the same from Israel. He wanted them to be a living sacrifice. He wanted them to live their worship. It wasn't to be, we go to the temple so often, or the tabernacle, and we worship sometimes. It was to be an everyday thing. Kind of like Paul says, pray without ceasing. It's your life. It's who you are. And that's who they were supposed to be. And all of that also includes, to me, the display, their attempt to be a large power in the world, but not wielding their power correctly. They tried to, just like everybody else, use it to their advantage, to clobber someone else. They made alliances with other nations for the same reasons. And so that's not who they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be representing God on the earth. They weren't supposed to be mingling with the other political powers of the earth. In fact, they weren't supposed to be a political power at all. They were supposed to be a nation. I guess you could still call it a political power, but a political power that was completely different than the political powers of man. They were supposed to be a people with God as their king. And then they decided, well, we don't want God as our king anymore. We want a human king, and we want to be like all the other nations. And then from there, of course, where things went. All of that can be taken into that verse in Isaiah. You worship me, with your lips, but your heart is far from me. Everything you've done has displayed that you are far from me, far from what I intended, far from what I wanted. And that's important. So human power, according to the wisdom of man, is the ability to overpower another by use of force, either mentally or physically. We respect power. We fear power. And that could be on a personal level. That could be, if you have a boss that's a tyrant and you're afraid of getting fired, that's mental power that someone has over you. And they might say things that they shouldn't say, or get their desires across in a way that is not displaying kindness and love for another human being. And you respect that. You respect it even if they do that, but you respect it for a different reason. We have laws and we obey the laws. I would love to have more money and get out of debt and everything. I would love to just go to a bank and take the money. It's wrong to rob. I know that. But also, I know that if I decide to do that, the chances are I might end up in prison for many years, and that would defeat the purpose of everything, because then when I got out, I would have nothing. So there's power and respect, and we know some people don't respect power, but most people do, and that's why we have a fairly orderly society. So, the other day, Danny was sending me texts about things that were happening in China. Honestly, I'll say I didn't know. I hadn't seen these stories, but it's not surprising because it happens all over the world. Talking about mass detentions and other inhumanities being used against certain ethnicities of people in China. Again, that it happens. I mean, it's happened in Africa, right? I mean, you think of the genocides and stuff in Rwanda, the things that went on in Bosnia, and all these places. These things happen. And what's always the immediate thought? The immediate thought of many people is, well, we're going to stop them. How are we going to stop them? Well, we're going to go bomb them. Well, why haven't we gone to war with China over this or over anything else? Because China is a major world power. They have a modern military with immense capabilities. War with China wouldn't be us sailing across the ocean in aircraft carriers and bombing China like in World War II. It would be China coming here and us going there. The casualties would be in the millions. And so there's no doubt to me that it would be a war. It would be just such a major scale. I don't even think we could fathom it right now. I told Danny, I'm like, this is no Iraq and Saddam Hussein who had a ragtag Air Force and Army that we just walk all over. It's a major power. So therefore, we respect that, right? And so when something like that happens and it needs to be done, and of course it's in the news, so it must be in the forefront, what do? Well, we do everything we can do through economic measures and other things to try to get them to stop. And that's because of respect of power. That's how humans see power. That might be an extreme example. After Danny and I talked about it, I would just pray every day that somebody is smart enough that we would never attempt to do anything militarily against a country like that. And I have every faith in our leaders that would not happen. That my faith maybe is misplaced, but hopefully it's not. I have to, I told him I have to think after the whole Cold War and nothing happened that, we would treat it the same. But that's not the power that God wields, and it's not the power that he wants us to recognize. Remember, his power is foolishness according to men, but it's wiser than men. His power is give yourself up for everyone else, not because you're going to lay down and let people stomp all over you, but giving of yourself to others. And that's what Paul says too about making the coals on their heads. The more and more and more people do things the way that God displayed, the better and better and better things would be. In Isaiah, we're gonna stay in Isaiah mostly tonight. In the book of Isaiah, chapters 30 and 31, God is telling Israel just that. He's telling them that man's power is hopeless. In chapter 31, in verses 1 through 3, now we know that Israel, there's already been, God's already said this is what's going to happen to you, and Israel is trying to circumvent this and make this not happen. But how are they doing it? It says, alas, for those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. Yet he too is wise and brings disaster. He does not call back his words, but will rise against the house of evildoers, who is Israel, and against the helpers of those who work iniquity. The Egyptians are human and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and the helped one will fall. They will all perish together. Where God says to them, the Egyptians are just humans, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. That is a very powerful statement. They are trusting in military might, and albeit not of their own, they're trusting on someone else's military might to help them, and whatever they have left of their own. But God is saying that's not the answer. I'm the answer. Your power is not the answer. I'm the answer. All the times you tried to use your power, that wasn't the answer. I was the answer. That's what he's saying. Do not put your trust in the military machine of men, because you will both fail. Because I said you're going to go into captivity, because of how evil you've become, that's what's going to happen. It has to happen. It has to happen for my good name, and it has to happen to bring you back to the place where you're supposed to be. You got to be knocked down several pegs so that you can start over. In chapter 30 and verse 1 of Isaiah, it says, the rebellious children are as good as dead, says the Lord. Those who make plans without consulting me, who form alliances without consulting my spirit, and thereby compound their sin. The fact that they were trying to find a way to militarily from another country protect themselves against the captivity that God was bringing to them, when God said, just go. Just go. If you go, it's eventually going to be good for you. Just go. Don't fight it. Even when I forget, the king his name starts with a Z. I can't remember, but he tried somehow to come up with a plan not to work it and to fight against them. And what happened? God said, if you do that, you and your sons are going to die. And they did die. Not pleasant deaths to the hands of the enemy. They should have just gone. Because when they did go, eventually what happened? Eventually they weren't slaves anymore. They became part of the society. A lot of them might have been servants of some types or anything, but there came a point where God said, just stay there because things are going good for you. Just some of you can stay. And others came out and came back and rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, but not all of them came back. So the point that they were making plans with Egypt, forming a military alliance, God said was compounding your sin. The sins that they've already committed, the reason that they're going into captivity, trying to come up with a military solution is a sin. And it's going to be added on to the sins that you're already doing. I think those are amazing statements against Israel. So, basically their peace plan, because what we're going to eventually start getting into God's peace plan, or how God wanted things to work out in the next week or so. But if Israel's peace plan was to hide behind someone else's power, God thought it was so sinful. If I know the cross absolves us of everything, but we have to think of what we do today that was similar to what Israel did, similar to what Egypt did, similar to what Assyria and Babylon did. Didn't they say that one of those countries, Babylon, or Assyria, maybe it was. Now I can't remember. One of the two went too far, and so they did too much with force, and so now God was going to go after them because he only wanted them to do so much. uh, but they did more. And so, it's, I think that it's just, it makes me wonder, today in our modern history, everything that we do to one another in this world. And I just think that's exactly what was happening in Israel's time. It's exactly what they were doing. Uh, and God said it was sinful. Um, and so you start to wonder what makes us think it's any different. Um, it's a hard question to answer. People get very philosophical about it. Um, it's the answer, I think, might be a lot easier. The answer is easier, not the actual carrying out of the answer, but I think the answer is easier than we think. Um, you know, you think of the statement Jesus said, live by the sword, die by the sword. You think about that. And of course, someone else says, well, he also told them that they need to make swords. There's a lot behind all of that. But that's a topic for another time. So the ultimate power is the cross. The cross is the Jesus way. The cross is God's way. It is what we are to imitate. You cannot, to me, it's my opinion, doesn't have to be yours. You can't imitate the cross when you are imposing human force, the idea of human force on people. You can't. It just can't be done because it's not what the cross is about. The cross is the opposite of imposing human force on another person. The cross was violent, right? It was a violent death. It was a violent action. A couple years ago, I read a slew of books about atonement, and one of the atonement theories I read, because there's many, and I think they all have great merits. One of them was the nonviolent atonement theory. When I first read that title, I thought that doesn't even make sense because the cross was violent. The idea behind it is that God was showing humanity, this is what you have become, where you're killing your own creator on a cross. That's what this has led up to. And by the resurrection and showing, I've overcome that. I have overcome it by laying down my life to you exactly like you do to each other. And so it becomes the answer, or in their view, it becomes God's call to say, stop it, stop the violence, stop the human power, and submit to me, not as an overlord, but as your creator who's trying to teach you that if you want the world and your world to be the place that it should be, then this is how you act. In Ephesians 5:1, Paul says, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. And in Thessalonians, he says, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord. For in spite of the persecution, you received the word with joy, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And I know I've said it often, but, I read, now I'm reading, I get Christianity Today. It's a magazine. It's great, honestly. There might be a lot of things that don't line up with what you think, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. It just gives you a snapshot of what's going on in Christianity at large. But they always have articles about Christians in other places. And now even in India, I guess the prime minister there, and he won his election on Hindu nationalism. And so part of Hindu nationalism is we are a nation of Hindus. So all these other people that have come in, we are going to persecute them, and we are going to do whatever we can to get rid of them and get them out of our country. And unfortunately for Christians and Muslims in India, it has meant murder, kidnappings, all kinds of terrible things. And these are the very things that the Thessalonians were up against. And Paul says, you became imitators of the Lord in spite of all that. What does that mean? That means that you stood up for the gospel and lived in the Lord, even in the face of, by doing this, I could die tomorrow. But this is how God wants me to live. This is the cross, and this is how I'm going to live. And of course, in God's want and desire is that everybody lives like that. Imagine if everybody lived like that. There would be no need for human force at all, because, you know, everybody's needs would be met. Everybody, the love would be just amazing in the world. It would be great. You know, it's not right now, but we can, you know, do what we can to make it that way. And it's each person in their relationship and their drive for living the gospel and living the cross, making a difference in as many people as possible around them. And that's what God desires for everyone. That's his display of power. Jesus said to be perfect as the Father in heaven is perfect. And that follows, it's in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, that follows a statement, the passage about loving enemies. Perfection. It's a tall order, but that's what the desire is. You know, the cross is a miracle. You know, I think of myself frequently, and I think it's amazing that God doesn't see all the things about me that I see. That's a miracle in itself, right? And that's how he sees everybody. So he sees it already as what it should be. It just needs to actually happen. And that's the work that he wants to do in you. You know, I'm not going to read about Philippians. Actually, I'm going to read it here in a minute. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. Probably become my favorite passage. It is what we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be seen in what human power would deem as weak. You know, it's what God's people did. They worshiped God in a country that jailed them, tortured them, and killed them. You know, you think of modern day people, and it always pops in your head, because the human thought of, wow, well, what if they had several guns and they could band together, and, you know, the Christians in India could, you know, they could form a group. They could hire security guards. And then when these Hindus came in, they could just shoot them. But that wouldn't be the cross. Wouldn't be. It's what we naturally want to do, but that's not the cross. The cross is living the cross, living what it stands for, showing the people of Thessalonians, the people of Thessalonica, they showed patience, they showed love, they showed grace, and they showed mercy. And the reason people saw it was not because of necessarily how they treated other Christians. It's because they saw it in their lives, in their societies. It's amazing. These things happen today in our world. And it's great to be aware of it, because it's really, it's sad, but at the same time, somewhat encouraging, as weird as that sounds. So Philippians 2, 5 through 11, and I'll wrap this up here in a minute. I know it's getting late. It says, and consider the example that Jesus, the anointed one, this is from the Passion Translation, has set before us. Let his mindset become your motivation. He existed in the form of God, yet he gave no thought to seizing equality with God as his supreme prize. Instead, he emptied himself of his outward glory by reducing himself to the form of a lowly servant. He became human. He humbled himself and became vulnerable, choosing to be revealed as a man and was obedient. He was a perfect example, even in his death, a criminal's death by crucifixion. Because of that obedience, God exalted him and multiplied his greatness. He has now been given the greatest of all names. The authority of the name of Jesus causes every knee to bow in reverence. Everything and everyone will one day submit to his name in the heavenly realm, in the earthly realm, and in the demonic realm. I think that's kind of cool that they put that in there, and in the demonic realm. And every tongue will proclaim in every language, Jesus Christ is Lord Yahweh, bringing glory and honor to God, his Father. A little note, I read something recently in one of the books I'm reading. The Tower of Babel, men had one language, and they were dispersed. Eventually, it talks as God, as men will talk in one language, the language of God. I don't necessarily think that's literal. Maybe when we, we die and we awake in his presence, there'll be a universal language in heaven. But here on earth, I think that language is just one thing. It's love. That's the language. And I think that's what God was looking forward to, a time when everybody would speak that language. Some people call it the universal language. And you say, oh, that's all touchy and philosophical, but it is. That's what the language of God is. So next week, we're going to get more into the prophet Isaiah and how God chose to fight and how this bears out in the cross and the New Testament writings. In Isaiah 55, he says, your ways are not my ways. And if you read the chapter before in that chapter, that's what he's speaking to. Your ways of power are not my ways. I finish with a quote from a commentary by Dr. Peter Pett. I read that he was a former Baptist preacher who is retired, and he has commentaries. It's on eSword for free for all the books of the Bible. I frequently try to use his because I just love the way he writes. It makes it very easy to read. It's not real technical. But he says these words summarize all that has gone before. The words of Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9 he's talking about. Strange as it may seem to man, God is working through his servant. From the first triumphal entry into the land by his servant Abraham, through his servant faithful Israel, right through the suffering and disfigured servant, who is finally glorified and established as a world ruler, and it is through that work that he will finally be exalted. For God does not work as man works. He does not think as man thinks. His ways are not man's ways. They are above and beyond all that man can conceive. His ways are the ways of a servant, the way of giving. And that's what the cross was about. And so next week we will continue on these thoughts.